Hi there and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today's episode is a continuation of this branch line station area and also that upper level town scene from the previous video, with a link up in the corner there for that. So there's several areas of progress made in this video, and that includes the back scene, a bit of hard standing type material in the upper level industrial area, and also a little bit of base colour painting on some of the landscape areas. There's also a wee bit of experimentation with some materials in creating a merge between some concrete slab effect and some cobblestone area as well. So this is quite a long video, so I might suggest maybe getting yourself a cup of tea or whatever takes your fancy, and maybe a few snacks or treats, and settle in to watch this video. So I think without further ado, let's just get into what I got up to. So looking at what needs to be done, one of the things that I sort of jumped in and sorted out first was the back scene, and this is just a temporary back scene that's just made up of tiled A4 printed images joined together. And the reason for that really is so I can sort of work out how the back scene is going to work in relation to the foreground, and also sort of tinkering with visual trickery here with the street scene. So as I sort of previously gave a sneak preview on Facebook, this street scene area that sort of goes off into another street, I chose a vantage point that was sort of probably the most common vantage point that I would view this area from in relation to the layout, so that it gave the impression that it carried on. So the back scene is now being printed at the local printers, and what I usually do is I get two printed, because if I stuff one of these up, then I've got a backup. So you can clearly see that the professional print is much sharper and clearer, and the colours are far more accurate than of course my printed back scene on the A4 printer. So it'll be a case of cutting out the MDF sheet that I'm actually going to use for the back scene and applying this to that. So we'll go into that shortly. So some other things that I can carry on with in this area is, of course, we're going to put a base coat of brown paint over these landscape areas, and I just use some really cheap household acrylic paint, a matte finish, and this is actually a blend of paint. I've just chucked a whole lot of stuff in here and mixed it together to get an earthy tone for these embankments. And then of course there'll be a base grey paint to go on this upper level here. Now down at this end here, of course, we've got this sort of simulated concrete effect on the previous upper level section I worked on, and so I want to continue that sort of concrete effect roughly to about here, and then from there it will lead into some cobblestone. So at this point I won't make it a hard edge, I'll sort of make it look like the cobblestones have kind of busted up and eroded away, and maybe they've filled in some broken up areas with concrete, so that it sort of continues through into a gradual transition between the two types. So for the concrete areas that I used in here, I'm actually just using some 2000 grit sandpaper, and we'll go through the process of how I sort of achieve that effect. So once I've done the effects on this, of course, I will dice these up into sort of smaller size concrete slabs and position them kind of a little bit randomly in a grid type format, but it's sort of to give the impression that maybe the concrete was laid in sections rather than all just in one go. So there's a few little bits and pieces to get on with, and I think the first thing we'll get into is applying one of these back scene prints to a sheet of MDF and slotting that into place. So now comes the scary part, which is applying this print to the backing board, and it can be quite tricky applying such a large area in one go. So what I'm using in this scenario is 3M multi-purpose spray adhesive, and I usually find this is actually pretty good, certainly for doing this type of thing, and it creates a nice sort of more or less even surface. And one other critical tool is a roller, and this really does help when it comes to smoothing it out, as opposed to using your hands or any other type of item to try and flatten it out. So I've just laid the print face down on a bit of card that's just going to avoid excessive amounts of overspray getting on anything else. And I guess the key here, they probably have directions on this, is to do it in nice even strokes. And I'm just going from the middle and working our way out with the roller. So there we have it, that is applied now to the backing board, and we'll just let that dry a bit. And then of course I've allowed for some trimming around these edges here, and there's a little notch here too where the baseboard changes height slightly, and that will be all trimmed once this is nice and dry. So I've now placed the Backscene back in there temporarily just to see how it looks, and it's certainly come out really well. I probably think the only disadvantage is I should have really printed both these different Backscenes in the same print run. This was printed a wee while back, and although these are from the same file using the same printers on the same printer, there's a subtle difference here in colour variation clearly come about from different print runs. As you can see, I've also given these embankments a base coat of that sort of earthy brown colour, and I've also given this upper level industrial area a base coat of grey. So the next step will be getting on to continuing this concrete slab area coming into here, and then working into a cobblestone area through this part. So taking a look at the concrete slabs that we're going to do as part of the continuation around the upper level industrial scene. We've got our sandpaper, once again as mentioned 2000 grit, and what I do is just go over it kind of randomly with some flat grey spray paint. Now this is Rust-Oleum satin granite, but really at the end of the day it's sort of, you can sort of use whatever, I guess, to sort of try and mimic sort of concrete colours. Now I'm not going to completely cover this. The idea is to sort of get some subtle tonal differences, and then with some bits of sponge it's a case of dabbing and smearing and resisting some of this paint in order to get some unusual effects. So I guess I should say that caution should be taken with spray paints. So I'm in the garage with the door open, it's well ventilated, I have the fan on. So we'll get underway with this and see how it goes. I've already given this can a good shake, so it should be good to go. Now I'm just smearing some of this and dabbing it with a sponge. And what you can also use if you really want to strip it back a bit, which is what I might do, is a bit of mineral terps will eat back into the paint and reveal some of the sandpaper from underneath. So just standard mineral turpentine, and I'll get a fresh sponge and we'll just drench a bit of a sponge with this. And as you can see, it's starting to pull back some of the paint, and I'm kind of just doing this really randomly. And of course the sandpaper is quite good because it does have that very subtle texture in it that might sort of imply a reasonably smooth cast concrete. So we're just using a paper towel as well just to soak up some of that mineral terps. and you can see the paint coming off on that. I mean, you could probably get away with just using the paper towel possibly rather than sponges. So I think that'll do for the paint dabbing and so forth. What I'm actually going to do is wait for this to fully dry, and then using a coarser grit sandpaper I can scratch back even further. And then of course, because I'm going to chop these up into smaller slab size segments of concrete and then rearrange them, you get this sort of even further breakdown of this general effect. So I've just been going over with a bit of this 3M Scotch pad, and that helps just to rough up some areas, and then also just a small piece of coarser grit sandpaper that sort of helps to scratch back the surface a little bit. And there's no rhyme or reason, it's just sort of random areas that we want to create some more textures. And lastly, I might just use just a pinch of terps in one of these. Whoopsie daisies, possibly a little bit too much in that. And I just want to see what this does. So I'm just going to actually lay this over the top sheet of paper towel so as not to smear any more. So it's certainly looking pretty random, and I'm reasonably happy with that effect. There's more can be done once this is actually laid down, because we can of course do some weathering over the top of this to add even more effect. So here's our concrete slabs diced up. So I've started to cut up the angles here for this unusual piece, which of course is the tunnel entrance component, and this is sort of done this way so that it kind of lines up with the existing concrete slab material, which is on the other upper level industrial area. So I'm just using PVA glue for this. I think that's the easiest glue material to use. So that's how it's coming out, and I think it gives a reasonably interesting effect, and the gaps sort of represent those gaps that you often find in areas where sections of concrete have been paved. So once this is dry, of course, I will trim off the excess around the edges. So I'll carry on with this and continue paving up to a certain point. So that's the concrete slab section now completed, and you know, it gives an interesting effect and simulates the idea that this is laid down in sections. And so of course this is not complete really, there's still weathering and so forth to do, and there will be other sort of treatments, possibly some sort of grit material, and then of course at this point here there'll be a sort of a merge between the concrete and some cobblestone. So with the concrete slab area complete, it's now a case of getting into the cobblestone area. Now I just use this Metcalf cobblestone sheet, and although it's not super fine detail by any stretch of the imagination, it suffices quite well, and by the time you've done some weathering and other bits and pieces to it, it has a reasonably convincing look about it. So this pack comes with full-size sheets, and then of course we've got some half sheets as well. So the other aspect too is I won't do the cobblestone all in one huge area, so it will be sort of broken up into smaller areas using this sort of perpendicular cobblestone edging as well, so it gives the impression that the cobblestones weren't all just laid in one big area. So I'll start trimming these up and working out a sort of a layout for these and take it from there. So that's how it's looking so far, and the majority of the cobblestone is all intact at this end, and then it's starting to break away and being replaced by concrete slab. Now I've glued the cobblestone over the top of the concrete slab here, so it kind of looks a little bit funny, but what the plan is here is I'm sort of going to merge the broken edges of cobblestone into the concrete, and I'm actually just going to use possibly a bit of tiling grout and potentially a little bit of putty and just sort of work it in to the edges so that it kind of blends in and looks like the cobblestones are actually embedded into the concrete. And then of course this will all be weathered up and grimed up quite a bit, so hopefully it'll sort of blend in quite well. Right, so now I think it's time for some good old-fashioned experimentation. So as I mentioned, I'd like to give the appearance that the broken up cobblestone edging is somewhat embedded into the concrete slab. So this gives the idea maybe the concrete slab was poured up to the edges of the cobblestones. So there's a couple of ideas I'm going to have a crack at in the hopes of achieving this end result. So there's a number of materials here that I'm going to experiment with. So we have tiling grout, and this is actually a dark grey grout, so I'm not quite sure how well that will work. We have standard plaster of Paris, and I may blend that with the tiling grout in order to lighten up the grey. And then lastly, we actually have some quick set concrete mix. Now I just happen to have a small amount left over in a bag that I thought I'd have a go at using. I certainly wouldn't go out and buy a whole new full 25 kg bag of this stuff just in order to try this technique. We also just have some standard DIY filler, and that's potentially another method, and also some Mod Podge as well. So I'm possibly thinking maybe a mixture of the Mod Podge and the tiling grout might create quite an interesting effect. So I think one of the key things to doing any kind of experimentation is not to initially do it on the actual area but on a test piece. So I've just glued some of the sandpaper texture, which of course is the concrete slab, and then applied a small strip of the cobblestone sheet. So we've got a number of tools here that may come in handy. We've got some stiff bristle brushes. We've also got a couple of different palette utensils that might be good for spreading the material once again. I've just got some throwaway pipettes for adding in water, and we have a plastic spoon just for mixing in material, and then we've just got some ice block sticks as well, which might come in handy. So we'll get this underway and just see what kind of results we might end up with. So I think we'll start with the tiling grout, and I might just do that just with water added first and just see what happens there. Now with tiling grout, obviously you need very little water, and I think on the instructions on the box for 1 kg of grout you only add about 200 mils of water, so this is actually quite runny, that, so I'm going to add another scoop. So this grout of course is actually going to dry a lot lighter than what it is at the moment, but even then I think it's possibly really still a little bit on the dark side. So this is where I'm sort of thinking that maybe a combination of the grout and some plaster of Paris might work quite well. So with the plaster of Paris in there, that certainly has toned it up a little bit to a closer match to the slab areas. So that could be a possibility. So we're going to take a look at this fast set concrete, and I probably wouldn't use it otherwise. I'm only giving this a go because I just happen to have a leftover bag of this material. Now this fast set concrete is definitely a lot more gritty, and I did have to sift out some of the larger stones that are in it. Yeah, so the fast set concrete is not really a suitable solution. It's just too gritty and pulls the gritty material around a bit with the spatula. So I think we can give that one a miss. So another option I wanted to try was mixing a bit of tile grout into some DIY putty and seeing how that works. So I've just added a little bit of water to this because, of course, adding the tile grout to the putty, it basically just completely dries it out. So this is just with a few drops of water in it. Yeah, I mean, that's quite an interesting effect, that one actually, but I've actually brushed over that with a wet brush as well, and you can actually get some quite interesting textures out of that. It kind of almost looks like concrete, doesn't it? So that is a possible viability. So that is the DIY polyfiller, bit of tile grout and just a bit of water. Now, one of the things I've noticed, and this is definitely why it's worth testing on a mock-up piece first, is of course with the moisture of all of these materials, of course working this too hard, it actually starts to affect the card cobblestone print. So knowing this now, what I'll be doing when I actually work on the actual site itself is I'll probably go over the entire area with a matte clear varnish beforehand. So essentially that is going to protect and seal in the cobblestone. Now the last one I wanted to try was actually just a bit of Mod Podge with some tile grout and just sort of see how that might work. So we'll give that a go. So that one on the end is the Mod Podge of tile grout. So we'll have to wait for these to dry before we can get a true representation of how they're actually going to look. But I'm kind of leaning towards this one here, which was the DIY polyfiller with tile grout and just a few drops of water to moisten it. It has quite a nice spreading ability, and the overall sort of finish looks reasonably convincing. So there we have it. I think this area is certainly starting to take shape, and I think the blend between the cobblestone and the concrete slab area has worked out relatively well. So one of the aspects that did actually change while I was doing this was I went back to the original mix of just simply tile grout and water, because as the mock-ups began to dry, the straight tile grout water mix actually came out a lot lighter than I was expecting, and was actually toning in quite nicely with the concrete slab area. Now the only thing that I did change slightly in order to match in the tone of the concrete slab was I actually popped in a few drops of blue acrylic paint, and that just helped to cool down the colour of the grout from its warmer tone. So of course more scenic treatments are actually going to be added to this area, and that will include some weathering powders to sort of tone things in even further. Of course there will be weeds and other types of overgrowth growing up between the cracks in the concrete and the cobblestones, and they'll probably also add some types of possibly oil spills and things like that to really kind of grime it up. I do want this area to have quite a run-down feel about it. So in general, this entire area is starting to take a little bit more shape, and things are starting to tie in, and I'm really starting to get an idea of how this section of the layout is coming together, and also the connection between this branch line station area, the upper town scene, and the industrial area that now actually connects around the corner to the previously built sections. So I'll leave it there for now. It's been quite a lengthy video, but I certainly hope that you've been able to get some inspiration and ideas from what I got up to in this episode. So I'll sign off for now. Once again, do take care, everyone. Look after yourselves. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.